Tomorrow is June 19th, which is celebrated as Juneteenth. It's a celebration that began in 1865 when Union troops first entered the Confederate state of Texas, and a general made a proclamation announcing that all the slaves were free, that they were now enjoying the same rights as their former masters. And so this day is properly celebrated as a celebration of the ending of a odious institution of chattel slavery. I'd like to say a few words about that odious institution to clarify some things that a lot of people don't really know because we're deliberately misinformed by our so-called public education system. In the late 1600s in the it wasn't the United States then, it was the British colonies, slavery had not been institutionalized yet. There were poor white people who were indentured servants and black people who were taken from Africa against their will, but they were basically legally in pretty much the same category. And in fact, the concept of a white race as opposed to other races was not established. You can't find mention of the white race in the late 1600s. People were referred to by where they came from. They were Irish, they were Scottish, they were French, they were African, they were from maybe this or that Native American tribe. But the idea of whites, as we, have that idea today, was not current. And black Africans, as I said, were in bondage in a legal relationship to their masters that was essentially the same as the bondage of many people of European descent. And I don't have time to go into it now, but their conditions were often equally horrible. And they escaped together, and they were in solidarity often, typically, against their masters. And in particular, in the late 1600s, there was something in the Virginia colony called Bacon's Rebellion, which was a complicated situation. But the interesting part of it is that it involved African slaves and European, essentially slaves, allied together in tremendous solidarity, rising up against the British authorities in the colony. And it was a military rebellion in which the indentured servants and black Africans almost defeated the British military power. It scared the hell out of the authorities, who were locally, they were the big tobacco plantation owners who were exploiting this black and white labor to make a lot of money, and then they were backed up by the British Crown. So they had a problem on their hands. It was overt solidarity between all of their exploited laborers across all racial, national lines, including in particular the blacks and the people of European descent. So in the early 1700s, the Virginia colony government, which was called the House of Burgesses, came up with an idea. Their idea was to pass a new law that would be a total break from existing policy that went back, for hundreds and hundreds of years in Britain. And this new law was to deny civil rights to people purely because of the color of their skin. Now, this was in the early 1700s. It was before uh, Thomas Jefferson was born, if I'm not mistaken. I'm going to provide all sorts of articles where you can get more details about this at the links at the bottom of this video. Um, and the House of Burgesses came up with this idea because they knew they had to split the European descendants from the African descendants and turn them against each other and drive a wedge between them. And this was their idea, was to to explicitly discriminate against the Africans based on skin color by denying Africans uh, their civil rights. Now, at this time, some Africans in the colony were wealthy. They weren't all, in a condition of slavery. Um, but these people, despite their property wealth, were going to be denied their civil rights nonetheless because of their skin color. Well, the House of Burgesses couldn't pass the law on its own. It had to get approval from the mother country, from England, from the Parliament, for all of its laws. And the person in charge of deciding whether to give approval or not was called an attorney general, and he was an upper class aristocratic type, of course. And when he read this proposed law from the House of Burgesses, he was furious. And he said this was outrageous, that the denying people their rights because of the color of their skin was totally immoral and wrong and so forth. Because at the time, what was considered proper was to deny people rights because of their lack of owning property. That was perfectly fine. Property owners of wealth were considered to be better people and deserving of more rights and so forth. But the idea of doing it based on the color of one's skin was outrageous. I'm pointing this out because what it shows is that when people say, well, back then, the days of Thomas Jefferson, who had slaves and talked about equality, but saw nothing wrong with, enslaving black people in chattel slavery, people say, well, that was because they didn't understand back then what was wrong with racism. And the fact is, yes, they did understand it. This upper class attorney general who reacted in horror at the idea of racial discrimination based on skin color was around before Thomas Jefferson was born. They understood it, and the law ended up being passed anyway in Virginia eventually because they needed to turn the black and whites against each other for divide and rule. And this the upper class understood. And in order to enact the new laws that became the basis of the slavery that we think of today as the outright racist slavery, they had to overturn other centuries of long-held understanding. For example, it had always been the case that a person in the British realm inherited the status of their father, but in the new racist structure that was being created, this was a problem because when white masters were impregnating their black slaves, which they did not only for maybe whatever personal reasons they had, but it was also a business model to create more slaves, which was economically profitable. Well, then the slave, I mean the child, had to be was going to have dark skin and had to be considered a slave, and so they had to have the child's status be inherited from the black mother, and and so this overturned the entire structure of British social norms. But they had to do this in order to uh, uh, avoid another Bacon's Rebellion kind of solidarity situation. And uh, the point I guess I want to end on is this: the racial discrimination of slavery and then of Jim Crow and of the discrimination that continues today in various ways. It is for the purpose of creating resentment and mistrust between the 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 people of color who are discriminated against and the people who are now called white, who are not the objects of that discrimination. The purpose is to create mistrust between these two groups of working class people, to create resentment, and to prevent solidarity from developing. And this is in order to maintain the oppression of all working class people, no matter what their skin color. For example, Jim Crow in the South was used to prevent the creation of labor unions and to drive down the wages of the poor whites. And poor whites in the South under Jim Crow had wages that were substantially lower than the wages of white working people in the North. The idea that that this discrimination against one group harms all ordinary people is the great insight of the labor movement with the slogan, "An injury to one is an injury to all." The ruling class hates that slogan and works very hard to prevent people from understanding how true it is. And that is why the ruling class promotes the opposite idea whenever it can, and most recently it takes the form of promoting the idea of quote, white privilege. That's the idea that ordinary white people benefit from racial discrimination against non-whites. Nothing could be further from the truth, but the ruling class promotes this idea, and I'll attach an article here in the bottom, showing exactly how they've done that. The Rockefeller and the Ford Foundation have been doing that, and the reason is that it reinforces the idea that ordinary white people benefit from racial discrimination against non-whites, and that of course feeds into the mistrust and resentment between the two groups. And unfortunately, the left has bought this lie, swallowed it, line, hook, and sinker, to the point that a few years ago in Boston, where I live, a bunch of leftists, in the name of fighting racism, decided to go out of their way to attack white working class people just because they were white. Specifically, they used concrete barrels with their arms locked in them and so forth to block Interstate 93 in both directions in the morning commuting hour, because most of the commuters were white working class people, and they decided to block them with their bodies on I-93, even blocking an ambulance on its way with a patient on an emergency run to a hospital. And they did all of this in the name of anti-racism, which, of course, it pissed off all of the white commuters who were blocked this way, and it spread the ruling class lie, which is that anti-racism is really just code for anti-white. Well, this is what the left did. Now you might say, well, these were just a bunch of crazy leftists, but no, they had the full support of all the left organizations. Not a single left organization condemned what they did. They all reported it as an anti-racist action. Not a single left individual or intellectual or organization explained that what they did represented utter contempt for white working class people based on believing the ruling class's lie that racism is something that benefits ordinary people. The lack of solidarity that it currently exists between black and white working class people harms all of us. It's the reason why we have the most obscene economic inequality that we've ever seen, with 3 billionaire individuals owning more wealth than the bottom half of the entire American population. This would never be able to prevail, this inequality, if we had the solidarity that we need, and which the resentment between black and whites that the ruling class keeps fomenting, was not as strong as it is. So let's all celebrate Juneteenth, but let's understand what's really going on with everything from chattel slavery to the current racial discrimination that is taking place. Thank you.